Okay, so we have our second recorded session of the OPP discussion group, and we're very lucky to have Lillian Hinchley, who's a PhD student at Hartford, and she's going to be talking about Adorno's philosophy of literature and its relation to catastrophe. Do you want to go ahead?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashley, and thank you to OPP for asking me to do this. I'm just going to it's saying that I can't screen share at the moment. Is there any way? Okay, cool. I might just turn off my video if I can do that, because I'll probably get in the way of it. Okay, cool. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yep.
Okay, cool. So thank you very much, Ashley, for that wonderful introduction. After the initial period of lockdown, I often heard others discuss about their outlets to deal with the uncertainty. As a PhD student whose normal life is basically being squirreled away on a laptop, I have been in a privileged position to stay inside and use my work as a distraction. And yet, of course, this isn't exactly my normal. The closure of libraries and the cancellation of an archival trip I need to do in Berlin means that much uncertainty and stress have been put into the mix. I suddenly realised that the PhD could not be my only source of solace, of distraction. So I started playing Animal Crossing. If you're not familiar with this current gaming sensation, it's essentially a game where a raccoon landlord sells you a getaway package on an island. In this way, it didn't matter that I couldn't really go outside for walks. I could run on my virtual beach. It didn't matter that I missed my treat of nice coffee. I made a virtual cafe called Critical Tea and Coffee. But everything inevitably returns back to my PhD. This coping mechanism got me thinking, what would Theodor Adorno, the subject of my thesis, think of my approach to dealing with crisis? I will be spending the next few minutes briefly going over an aspect of my doctoral research, namely Adorno's literary theory and how he suggests literature might reflect catastrophes. In case you're new to Adorno, he was a 20th century German philosopher who was part of what is known as the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. In the 1930s, after the Nazis' ascent to power in Germany, Adorno was denied an academic post at Frankfurt University because he was half Jewish. Consequently, he received a refugee scholarship to take up a second PhD at Merton College, Oxford. Although Adorno was obviously caught up in a very different kind of crisis than the pandemic today, I want to think about how his subsequent thoughts on catastrophe and how he uses literature to confront the catastrophe might be thought about today. So let us begin by thinking about what Adorno thought of crises. Adorno was a Marxist scholar, so inevitably saw capitalist society as a society in crisis. And then, due to his experience of exile from his home country and the subsequent knowledge of the Nazi concentration camps, Adorno would then designate the Holocaust the major catastrophe in history. What is crucial to understand here is how Adorno located the logic of capitalism within the Holocaust. For example, he saw the precise, calculated killing of Jews in Auschwitz with its bookkeeping as an extension of the rationality of capitalism and the Enlightenment more generally. Adorno had a problem with how a self-designated enlightened society such as Germany had set itself as the bearer of truth, of being objective, and how this had descended into untruth, into a bloodthirsty fascist regime. Adorno was especially haunted by the crisis of representation bound up with these larger crises. For example, take Adorno's identity. In Nazi Germany, one would not be recognized as Jewish and German. The Third Reich was predicated on the eradication of the Jewish people. For Adorno, this demonstrated the contradiction of Enlightenment thinking. Rather than being objective and representing the whole, its resulting fascist regimes would leave things out. They would lie. As a result, Adorno pushed the idea that in the catastrophe, whether in capitalism or after the Holocaust, one could not grasp reality. He argued that capitalism gave us a version of reality that presented itself as total, as whole, as the only possible way of organising society. This meant that anything that does not fit into capitalism is excluded, just as Jewishness is excluded in fascism. Not only does this mean that there is a disjuncture between realising how society is at the moment and how it ought to be, in Adorno's opinion, but Adorno argued that fundamentally this meant that we were alienated from realising our bad situation in the catastrophe, of seeing that there was a disjuncture between the lies that capitalist society told us and its true oppressive state. In short, he argued that in capitalism, we can't really realise the alienation it inflicts upon us. This had particular consequences for his engagement with the Holocaust. After the Second World War, Adorno was critical of how German society was trying to come to terms with the catastrophe of Auschwitz. Adorno argued that a political project of coming to terms with Germany's fascist past merely glossed over the Holocaust, that this desire to get over Auschwitz meant that one was not truly coming to terms with its trauma, to the extent that one could not even represent the events of fascism, could not represent the concentration camps. He suggested instead that one should work upon the trauma of the Holocaust to truly come to terms with it, a notion borrowed from Freud, an act that, crucially, Adorno argued would allow one to truly begin to grasp the crisis, the wounds the catastrophe had afflicted upon us, to critically engage with this past and therefore realise a different, better society after the crisis has ended. So how did Adorno think that we might be able to represent the catastrophe, to represent the disjuncture between a society in crisis and a society that we ought to have? He turned to literature. As he would say of, for example, the writer Samuel Beckett's work. Beckett has given us the only fitting reaction to the situation of the concentration camps, a situation he never calls by name, as if it were subject to an image ban. This notion that literature offers the note only fitting reaction to the concentration camps might seem surprising. Considering that fiction is often, of course, fictional, it seems strange that Adorno would appeal to novels to talk about the real crises in politics and society, rather than, for example, philosophical texts or factual newspaper reportings on the event in question. This sticking point is what I want to draw attention to, because it's important to understand why Adorno privileged literature as a special critical instrument during crises. I will now briefly turn to a specific example. As you may have noted, for this discussion, I recommended Adorno's short lecture on Charles Dickens's The Old Curiosity Shop from Adorno's work Notes to Literature, Volume 2. If you didn't read it or you didn't get Adorno, don't worry, I'll just briefly go over Adorno's lecture now. Adorno focused his reading on the character of Little Nell, an orphan whose grandfather owns a shop full of bric-a-brac. The Old Curiosity Shop that the title is referring to. Adorno also discusses Nell's transition, whereby she and her grandfather flee London for the countryside, where, spoiler alert if you haven't read this novel, Little Nell dies from exhaustion. Whilst Nell's veneration into a cult figure saw her become a figurehead for Victorian sentimentalism, the fact that she was mourned by many readers started what is now a long history of critical backlash against her and all that she stands for. Even Oscar Wilde could not stand this representation of the innocent victim of modern society that many readers were mourning over. So, being the grump that he often is, Why was Adorno so interested in Nell as a fictional character with this critical history in mind? The answer is that he sees her as a figure who can shed light on and help him to interrogate the crisis. In this particular instance, he designates this as the crisis of capitalism, because this particular lecture predates the Second World War. This is evident in the following quotation. The heroine, a child, little Nell, victim of the mythic powers of bourgeois fate, and at the same time, the slender ray of light that fleetingly illuminates the bourgeois world. Here, Adorno is suggesting that there is something about the sacrifice of the innocent, this young girl, that offers that critical representation of the horrors of capitalism. Indeed, his lecture even opens with the idea that Dickens' novel offers an alternative vision, a society that is other than bourgeois society. As he comments, quote, for Dickens' fictional work, in which poverty, despair, and death have already been recognised as the fruits of a bourgeois world, a world to which only the traces of human warmth and kindness in individual human relationships can reconcile one, this work also contains the outlines of a completely different sort of view of the world. And what's interesting is Adorno uses the phrase pre-bourgeois, so he sees an aspect in which there's a non-capitalist aspect that shines through this particular novel. So why is Adorno identifying Dickens's novel and his fictional character Nell for being able to counter what he sees as the very real crisis of representation in capitalism? That's because he privileges the very fictional quality of literature. As we discussed just before, Adorno's problem with the idea of representation in the modern world is his notion that it is deceptive, it lies. Any claim to objectivity for him is a lie because it ignores what is being obscured and left out. He is incredibly critical of representational models such as newspaper reports or photographs because, he argues, they assume that one can grasp a truth, a wholeness, a reality that he thought was no longer possible. Because in capitalism and later in the war, reality itself becomes alienated and fragmented. Dialectically then, Adorno was interested in a mode that would instead embrace this gap, this aspect of society that had been left out, the wound, the impossibility of grasping meaning. And that's where literature comes in, precisely because literature does not necessarily claim to capture so-called reality. With its fictional quality, it offers a kind of divergence from that. Adorno was attracted to the idea that literature could therefore represent this lack, this empty space, this absence. As he would say elsewhere about contemporary literature, not a word in it has any value now if it does not say the unsayable, the fact that it cannot be said. In short, Adorno doesn't want literature that positively represents a certain crisis, in the sense that he's not interested in, say, a novel about the Holocaust to talk about the Holocaust. He was against directly political works because he was apprehensive about the dictatorial potential of the author, who merely tells the reader what to think. Adorno wants the reader to be an interpreter, whose interpretation is also frustrated. He wants fiction that can talk about a subject negatively, through the breach, through its meaninglessness. He sees in Nell's death that gap, that resistance space, that points to the bad world and its infliction upon us, and the world that it pretends to be. There, he glimpses hope for a different world, where Nell would not have to become a martyr. Of course, this is all complicated by the fact that the Old Curiosity Shop is explicitly about capitalism, that little Nell is offered as a sacrifice despite her innocence, who exposes the injustices in Victorian society. However, it's important to see that Adorno is not merely taking the content of the story at face value. As he continues, Nell is herself an allegorical figure through and through. She seemed to exist in a kind of allegory, says the narrator of her. Here, Adorno is playing with the fact that Dickens self-consciously offered this novel as an allegory, or a narrative that offers a moral meaning within it. Although I can't go into too much detail now, Adorno is here adapting Walter Benjamin's theory of allegory. Benjamin was reacting to a distinction that certain Romantic poets made between symbol and allegory, and I'm probably misrepresenting this by trying to simplify it, but in general, many Romantic poets preferred symbols or images that were replete with meaning, but that kind of pointed to exactly what the symbol was. So for instance, a sun might have lots of particular meaning in it, but you still get that it's meant to be connected to the sun. In contrast, they criticize allegory because allegory was often criticized for disconnecting an image or a symbol from its obvious meaning, and that often allegory offered something to be interpreted, that a symbol that is allegorical stands for something other that works on another level. Walter Benjamin took this notion of allegory and kind of adapted it, turning to the obsolete souvenirs and objects of 19th century Paris. Just like the junk in the old curiosity shop that no longer has any use value to be exploited in capitalist society, Benjamin was inspired to think how this emptying out of use could be correlated with the emptying out of meaning with allegory. For him, he saw allegory as a way of destroying meaning, of making images into ruins. It was then in that very meaninglessness that he located salvation. In this light, Adorno is inspired by this very specific Benjaminian notion of allegory. He turns to Dickens because his novel points to something that has been left out, something that has been suppressed and destroyed. But crucially, it does not offer us a specific meaning for him. To understand this, I think it's useful to concentrate on Adorno's comparison of Dickens with Kafka in the lecture. And this comparison can be illuminated by his comments on Kafka's work elsewhere. As he says, Kafka's work expresses itself not through expression, but by its repudiation, by breaking off. It is a parabolic system, the key to which has been stolen. Yet any effort to make this fact itself the key is bound to go astray by confounding the abstract thesis of Kafka's work, the obscurity of the existence with its substance. Each sentence says, "Interpret me," and none will permit it. Here, Adorno embraces the way in which literature provokes us to interpret, to think critically, but, and this is important, without giving us any specific meaning to interpret. Adorno embraces this bind. He sees the places where the gaps, the unsayable, trip us up at the very places where we can start to talk about and interrogate what is unsayable about a crisis. So with this in mind, I turn back to my Animal Crossing escapades and think, what would Adorno think of this as a way of coming to terms with the present crisis? With the capitalist model of exchange for bells, the game's currency, instigated by the landlord raccoon Tom Nook, I'm pretty sure Adorno would think my mere replication of a coffee shop in a virtual medium to be indulgent, a mere photographic replication of our current bad society, rather than a genuine critical diversion that dialectically helps me to think about the difficult questions of this time. It seems that my virtual inventory in my virtual house, with the virtual lamps and protein shakes that are gathering dust, are perhaps not the object of the old curiosity shop that Adorno has in mind, though perhaps Benjamin would think differently. But I'm genuinely interested in thinking about to what extent Adorno's notion of a literature that denies fixed meaning in order to confront and recover the genuinely meaningful truths about crises might be used, or even interrogated, or even criticised in our current climate. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, Lillian. Do we have any questions so far? And I would also like to make a suggestion that if anyone has any clarification questions, they can either, so I'm just observing how people are applauding for you on Zoom, which is very so yeah, if you have a clarification question, either in your video, just like do a C, or if you're typing it, you can start the question with a C, and all other questions are also welcome, all other kinds of questions. I suppose to start with, I do have somewhat of a clarification question, but more an invitation for you to expand on this topic. How does literature say the unsayable about a crisis, for example? What's Adorno's view on this, or perhaps yours as well?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and really my thesis should be answering it. So I probably, because as I was saying to you, I'm in my third year now, so I probably should have like a very succinct, like sexy answer to that. But yeah, I mean, I'm doing different chapters on the way that he turns to Anglophone literature in particular. So I've only kind of started with Dickens, my Dickens chapter, writing it this term. But I also I finished a chapter on Beckett, and what's quite interesting is there's quite a big therapeutic aspect to what Adorno is talking about when he's thinking about literature. And in a way, I think sometimes it gets a bit confusing, and I actually think that sometimes Adorno is not being completely, like, what he does in practice doesn't necessarily match up with what he's saying in his theory, because it is one of those things where I'm genuinely like, okay, and I see this in your question, like, you know, how can you make literature say the unsayable? Even, you know, it's still a representative mode, so how do we do that? And so another way that I sometimes like to think about it is Adorno, and one of the reasons why I like Adorno is because he's so miserable, and I think that when he's kind of talking about this difference between kind of getting over the Holocaust and then kind of trying to actually work upon the trauma, because Adorno's become like a go-to source in like testimony literature and Holocaust studies. So you know, there's still people using it who are directly talking about direct Holocaust testimony and still kind of thinking what Adorno had to say. And I think just what I find, and one of the reasons why I'm very drawn to Adorno is he means negativity. Obviously, there's a philosophical sense when he talks about literature, and a negative literature in the sense that it's trying to talk about the unsayable. But I also think what's important in that is also just the kind of more basic understanding of negativity, and the fact that he doesn't have a problem with dwelling on things that are uncomfortable and make us sad. Like, I think, I mean, turning it to the current situation, like, there's a lot of conversation in politics where it's like, oh, you know, we shouldn't talk about the difficult questions now, like, now's not the time. And I think there's been a lot of people being like, but when is the time going to come? Like, when can we ask those difficult questions? And there's a lot of really important points to be made about holding people to account. So it's a bit like, you know, I think sometimes what Adorno was worried about is when a memorialization of, for instance, the Holocaust just kind of turns into something that doesn't actually deal with it, and everyone thinks, oh, you know, I've kind of done my bit and we can now kind of move along. But he felt that actually there's this injustice, there's these things that are being kind of left out that he wants to dwell upon, and he doesn't really care so much about people that are uncomfortable about dwelling upon the uncomfortable stuff. But I think when we're thinking about the unstable, because that was actually a quotation about Beckett, which I probably should have contextualized better, about his, because it's from the essay Titles, where he's talking about Beckett's novel, The Unnameable. Like, that's the actual title of the book, so he's like playing on that. And for my Beckett chapter, I talk about how Adorno comes at his reading of Beckett from a very kind of therapeutic angle, from a very psychoanalytic therapeutic angle. And there he talks about the fact that often, and I think often when we have psychoanalytic interpretations of literature, it's often criticized for like trying to diagnose a text or trying to diagnose a person and kind of get to this unconscious and like solve someone's problems or solve their mental illness. And I think the therapeutic model is an interesting way to think about what Adorno is trying to say here, because he was actually very interested in dwelling upon the subject of mental illness, for instance, and the fact that he saw in Beckett this kind of discussion of failed therapies, and the fact that often he was actually interested in the idea of a therapy that fails, and the discussion of it, because it kind of points to the failure of therapy in capitalism, which is the idea that one should just get well to be a productive worker. It's not really about genuinely being a better person. It's just about becoming better in accordance to a system. And so in some ways it does kind of, again, it brushes up this whole like, oh, one can't have a text about the Holocaust to talk about the Holocaust. But I think in some ways he's just very interested in what is the current system excluding, like what's kind of getting dropped out of the conversation. And then he's very interested in authors who seem to kind of capture that often hopelessness and meaninglessness, but he finds that really interesting because he thinks that it acts as a kind of foil, it acts as a way to be like, actually therapy, a failed therapy would seem like a really bad thing, but he's like, actually it shows the fact that we need therapies that are better, that actually address our needs. So I feel like I don't want to go in, because he has a book, Negative Dialectics, and even the title of that like scares me, like even talking about it. But there's a whole thing about him being, it's ultimately about drawing attention to the fact that there's a discrepancy between what capitalism or what the Nazi regime is saying is the objective, their narrative, and then what the reality actually is, because there's two sets of reality that were being offered. And he likes literature that actually points to that discrepancy, that goes, actually, there's a gulf there. And so that's why he's very attracted to these images of like the wound or a rip or fragmentation, because he's, even though he's not happy for the wound, like there's a lot of poetry that he writes talking about the fact that fascism like inflicts on women, for instance, or onto the Jewish body. He's not happy for the fact that the regime has done that, but he sees, there's an aphorism in Minima Moralia where he talks about the woman whose wound, like she feels the truth when she bleeds from it. And so it's this idea that as long as we have something that's kind of a breach, it represents the fact that that isn't the whole truth, because there's like a tear in the fabric of this narrative. So that's, a kind of meandering explanation of kind of what I'm looking at in my thesis for. I should have a snappy answer to that, to be honest.
Well, I thought that was great. Thank you, Lillian. It did make me think though, because I might have misheard, but originally in your talk, you said something about Adorno not really liking political literature. So it seems that he maybe the intention, or his intention of prioritizing literature for saying the unsayable, is that because the unsayable is stuff that's wrong with capitalism or a certain regime or something, and that's what needs to be changed. So how is it that he wants to highlight these things, whatever his intention, but he doesn't seem to like political literature? And how do you strike a difference between the two?
No, that's a really good question, and I'm really happy that you picked that up, because Adorno had an essay called A Commitment. It probably has a longer title, but I can just remember Commitment. And so he sees literature that has like a political message as being committed literature. And so in a way, because Adorno wants literature to be political, and he sees it in a very politicized way, because he's a Marxist theorist in his literary theory. He's interested in the materialism underlying kind of literary production and things like that. But Adorno has he wants to relate the author's intention. Like he wants to cut the author's intention from the book and the reader's kind of reception from the book. So kind of what I mean by that is you have someone like Brecht, who has very political theatre. And even though like Adorno has time for Brecht in some ways, like he just thinks that it's problematic to have, for instance, a piece of theatre that has a particular message to the audience. Like it's kind of like this pre-packaged message that they have to take away, and there's like a certain way. I mean, there'll be people that are scholars of Brecht that are like, no, you're misrepresenting, but it's just the fact that he's kind of uncomfortable. Like if you were going to write I don't know, a book about capitalism, just kind of being like, capitalism is really bad, like he's just, and I guess it's because there's a lot of studies on the radio that he does and things like that, but he's just very uncomfortable about a style of narrative that what the author says goes, and that we as readers like must take this particular moral and run with it, which is kind of, that's kind of what I was trying to get at a little bit in Dickens, because there is this weird thing where Adorno's like, yeah, like anti-capitalism, but then you're a bit like, well, yeah, like you're kind of following what, you know, there's this moral message in Dickens that people have a problem with. But then, as I was saying with Allegory, it's the fact that Adorno is also interested in disconnecting maybe a character or someone from an interpretation. And so the Kafka quotation that I brought up is the fact that it's calling, he sees Kafka as inviting interpretation, but what he sees as kind of vital to that is this, it's not permitted. And so I guess in his, I mean, as a literary theorist himself, like he bastardizes the authors that he's working with, and I think this is like a kind of, it's the kind of bind that I'm working with, because he's inspired by authors, but then you wouldn't necessarily go to Adorno to learn about Joyce, for example, because the reading that Adorno does of Joyce, and he's saying, oh, this is what Joyce is doing, like it's very much like through his lens. And so what Adorno does seem to kind of have time for, though, in regards to the author, he's not interested in a message that they're putting into literature. So if they're like, oh, you know, war is bad or you shouldn't eat meat or stuff like that. He's not interested in that because he just thinks that he's uncomfortable with that dictating kind of narrative from an author to a reader. He wants to give more space for interpretation, for the reader to be freed up and take it how they want in a different way. But when I'm looking at Joyce and Adorno, where Adorno does kind of have time for the author is he's interested in the actual production of literature and literary techniques. So he actually is interested in literary innovation. So for instance, for example, James Joyce and his interior monologue, or some people call it stream of consciousness, where you have just lots of lines replicating like human thought without punctuation. And so that's kind of where Adorno saw an opportunity to kind of use literary technique in which you could kind of use it to kind of, in ways, to surprise the reader and in order to invite them to kind of think about a topic in a slightly different way, because the text itself, it's not written in a way that's trying to give you like a very easy experience of just being fed a particular message. And that's Adorno has an essay as form which kind of talks about this, and he gets criticized a lot for his language and way of writing, which I think that fair enough, because Adorno is sometimes really annoying to read, but he was very interested in a mode of narrative that forced readers to really think, and he was interested in ambiguity. So it's these kind of techniques that you use. So in some ways, I mean, there's a whole debate about different aesthetics, but it's just, he tended to be interested in authors that used kind of experimental writing techniques, because it threw off that notion that one should just be given a message in literature. And instead, and if you read something like his aphorisms in Minima Moralia, like you can spend like hours and hours just like reading one of them, because he kind of wants you, I mean, even in a way, this is kind of him directing the reader to do what he wants us to do. So in some ways it's not that different maybe from like Brecht, who wants us to engage with a particular political insight, but it's just trying to disrupt that notion of easiness, and so we can just, it's trying to make us think really deeply.
Okay, great. So yeah, it seems to me that the reason why he doesn't like political literature is very similar to the reason why he doesn't like news articles, something that is very objective, because it's got a certain message. And it does seem in line to me that that's in line with him being a Marxist scholar, right? Him sort of having these issues with capitalism, which is that capitalism which involves everyone just doing their like economic duty, like for the purpose of like the markets or whatever, which doesn't really allow for individual thought or like diversity in that sort of sense. So it makes some sense to me along those lines as to why he's critical of these things, but loves this sort of like grey area literature. I believe we have a couple hands up. I'm not sure if that's a hand up from Andrew, because Andrew's been waiting a while, but if he could give us a signal that he does actually have a question.
I was just saying in the chat that I'll defer to Suruti to speak first. I'll come back after that.
Yeah, sure. Let's go to Shruti then.
Thank you. I was just wondering if, I suppose you touched on this a little bit when you were talking about it, how he really wants us to focus on the writer's intentions. But I suppose I'm wondering if Adorno recognizes when, the writer's intentions can fall short of like what they're actually doing. So right now I'm sort of like studying the Haitian Revolution, and something that recent scholars have been really doing is sort of engaging with texts written by, like advocates of slavery, but also like, advocates for abolition, but also like really trying to gauge narratives on slavery. Like, and I mean, obviously like those narratives are very polemical, but like going back to this idea of saying the unsayable, I suppose what I'm really trying to say is that, I mean, even when there is an intention to create this narrative that fits into a capitalist like rhetoric, it can fall short, and how these like political, like very overtly political writings can actually like represent the gap that exists between the capitalist narrative and reality much more than like, they, like the author either intended or, on first reading we might even, gather from it.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think because also Adorno is very interested in the notion of failure, and I think that's sometimes I find quite an interesting way, because it's interesting because he also has a weird relationship with things that are kind of inherently very polemical about capitalism, for instance, in which, like for instance, he hates things like Hollywood and the radio and astrology columns, but then he like uses them in his study to like say stuff about capitalism, for instance. So he does this whole book about an astrology column in, I think, an LA publication or something, but like he's still doing critical theory with it, and so and I guess what's kind of weird about Adorno is the fact that he puts so much emphasis on testimony and kind of like speaking your truth. So in some ways I kind of think that him kind of bashing on like intention, for instance, like I don't know, like I think that he sometimes allows for his own intention of things and the way that he wants to read things, but like maybe isn't so charitable towards what other people have to say. But it's just really interesting because he still nevertheless picks up on things that he says that he hates, but then he kind of thinks that they themselves are kind of often I was gonna say like kind of monuments to what he's trying to say anyway.
Do you think then maybe that's a contradiction within his work, where like he's obviously so preoccupied with finding the truth, but to even and he very much acknowledges the power of rhetoric and the, like how much like capitalism almost depends on us believing in the rhetoric it creates. Do you think that maybe it's a contradiction in his work that he even thinks that like it's possible to grasp at the truth, or fiction created within capitalist societies, within capitalist means of production, can get at the truth?
That's also a really great question, because there's a lot of there's like students of Adorno who like picked up on that, and the kind of like stickiness, that totality, and kind of believing in the notion of the truth. A lot of people think that he kind of gets stuck in a little bit of a bind because he doesn't. What's really interesting is Adorno came from a very bourgeois family, and so he has a go at the bourgeoisie, but then he still was like very much brought up in the sort of, because this is the thing, a lot of people say that Adorno wants to destroy like Western civilization and Western culture, but like he was like brought up on like Wagner and Goethe and a lot of like the culture that was then sort of used for like German nationalism. So there's a really interesting thing there where Adorno's, he has a quotation, it's like, it's no longer possible to say I, which is what he's talking about, is that inability to represent, about the inability for subjectivity that you might get in 19th century novels where we can represent the individual. And so in some ways, like, he's not particularly mourning that, because he kind of sees a very individual focused society like capitalism ultimately kind of kneecaps itself, because it's so focused on becoming individual that it alienates itself and can't kind of sustain itself, so it stops being an individual. But then because critical theory, it's about thought, like he puts so much into theory and theorizing, and sees thinking really deeply about things as really important. And so there is, I mean, I feel like there was one point where I kind of felt like I could kind of understand like maybe what his like counter would be to that, but like recently, because I've been working on this whole like issue of him thinking that there is a truth, and he uses like kind of he wants to think that, to be able to think again, like he wants to think again. He sees the solution in critical thinking. So there is this kind of tension in which he's like, okay, we can't think anymore because there's this rationalized kind of thinking that leads to irrationality, but then the solution is kind of, let's think about things. But I guess just in some ways, the way that I've found most helpful is like what I was saying about the Beckett and kind of therapy. He's just very interested in, even when things seem very totalizing, like there are things that do get excluded, or they're there, but they're just not being thought about. So he is kind of, he kind of accepts it as a totality, but he's just very interested in that tension between kind of the part and the whole, basically. Like that's what a lot of his theory is.
Oh
yeah, sorry.
That's a great question and answer. Thank you for that, Lucy. Could we go on to Andrew's question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, loads to think about there, Lillian. Thank you very much. I mean, you're absolutely right. I don't think Adorno does, kind of want to destroy Western civilization. It's about sort of him feeling that that's, being destroyed by the overwhelming rationalism that's taking place. It's that, it's that restriction on the self, on the ability to think creatively and critically that he's complaining about. That fragmentation. There are a couple of things that I wanted to pick up on, though. I was really interested in your comment that I think you said this in so many words, that literature doesn't aim to capture reality. I was like, well, sort of. Is it also kind of, is what you're saying that it's more about the particular relationship between literature and reality, in that, of course, literature is in some ways trying to capture, even something like Beckett is trying to capture something about reality. It has to be realist to some degree to recognize it, but it's doing that in a very kind of alienated, a sort of distanced way. And just the thing that I wanted to tack on to the end of that was to kind of get you to say something maybe a bit more about form as such. Because of course, one of the things, so talking about Beckett as a literary theorist, but of course, he's sort of a theorist of music, then philosophy, and then maybe even after that, a literary theorist. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the relationship between those things. Sorry, that was a lot of questions.
No, that was really interesting.
Answer a bit of it, answer some of it. You did talk about something else.
But yeah, good to see you, Andrew, as well. No, I think that's totally fair. And also, I just want to add a caveat that partly because I'm trying not to be so much in PhD mode. Like, it's the kind of thing where I can imagine, like, if I wrote something like that actually in my thesis, like, I think my supervisor would just be like, what are you doing, Lillian? So yeah, it was kind of like causing a lot of problems by just trying to simplify a little bit. But no, you're totally right. It's that dialectical aspect to reality, and yeah, I kind of think that, more specifically, I just think that what I was trying to sort of grasp at is kind of, there's a lot of notions of kind of a sort of naturalistic notion of reality, in which just that assumption that we can kind of get a camera lens and see the whole picture, for instance. So what more I was trying to grasp at there is the fact that, yes, he's not wholesale having a go at the connection between literature and reality. It's more that he thinks that certain forms represent that alienated reality.
Sorry, I think sort of even more particularly that, you know, kind of conventional realist forms aren't enough to, you know, don't get to the heart of the issues that he sort of diagnoses within capitalism. You know, that, you know, kind of a neat, a linear sort of narrative structure doesn't allow us to access the sort of disjunction between our experience of the world and the way that we're asked to conduct ourselves in it, or indeed are able to conduct ourselves in it.
Yeah, no, definitely, yeah. Yeah, because the thing that I'm working on at the moment is Adorno's interest in realism in conjunction with modernism. So yeah, my head's like full of the whole like kind of Adorno-Lukács debate at the moment. But yeah, I was just quite aware that also like modernism and realism, because it's an interdisciplinary group. I remember I sent Ashley a message about what I was gonna talk about, but yeah, it made me realise that actually even stuff like in a literary context, what realism and modernism mean aren't necessarily the same as like a philosophical one that people take. But also, yeah, on your second point, yeah, I think that's a really good point. And again, with like music and things like that, obviously, Adorno himself was a musicologist as well. He just spun so many plates that I can't even deal with like how many things that he did in his life. And of course, yeah, I think, I mean, I guess I'm focusing mainly on novels in particular, even though obviously Beckett, one thing I particularly picked up is the fact that Beckett did plays and things like that. But I guess because I'm very interested, especially from like, for instance, essay as form, a lot of it is about writing and the written word. Like that's what I'm specifically focusing on, but I'm quite aware that what I'm looking at is just a mere fragment of the variation of like all the different aesthetic forms and things like that Adorno discusses.
Okay, great. Could we hear from Kieran?
Hi, so sorry. Yeah, thank you for the talk. I might have missed that you said something like this, but I was just interested in the idea of, yeah, so you said that he critiques astrology and then sometimes also uses it. And I was wondering if that kind of contradiction opens up the possibility for the reader not to treat him as just directly imparting truths, that kind of Brecht model you talked about. And so that maybe the contradiction's there for a reason. And as an analogy, someone who knows more about the Torah, please correct me, I heard on a podcast, this is really not from great study, but that there are sections in the Torah where they simultaneously criticize the practice of animal sacrifice in front of like, but the priests who are doing it are also the priests who do the animal sacrifices, and there's that kind of interesting contradiction which creates lots of interpretive possibilities. Yeah, so just wondering about that.
Yeah, no, and yeah, that's a great question. And also, I like the stairs as well. I've noticed. Yeah, well, Adorno. This is another reason I like Adorno, because he's miserable. But I also like Adorno because he puts contradiction like at the center of his philosophy, with dialectics, and I find that really interesting, because I think often contradiction is kind of seen as like a bad argumentative move and logic, but actually, like, even in those moments when Adorno like trips himself up, as it were, like, I don't know, it's kind of, there's always a joke about Hegel, like, if anyone said, oh, you know, your work, you know, obviously isn't true, he'd be like, ah, but like the dialectic, like, it means it is also simultaneously true. And so it's kind of weird, because it's kind of that struggle between being a scholar and then also kind of thinking about the kind of philosophical system that Adorno was also thinking in, because I have to sometimes be like, oh, you know, he's not being completely honest with us here. But then equally, he puts that contradiction into his mode, like he wants us to be comfortable with kind of like negating things and disagreeing with things and like kind of finding that contradiction, because he finds actually contradiction, as with like the kind of gap and the things that kind of counter the main narrative. Like, that's exactly what he's interested in. Like, he's really interested in those moments, and that's where I find critical theory really interesting, because I always say, like, it really confuses me, but I kind of enjoy those moments of confusion, and I think that actually, in a way, like, he's enjoying the fact that he can write in a way that we can then kind of realize, it's not really, how can those both be happening at the same time? And I think to some extent it is a deliberate strategy by what he's doing.
Great, thanks for the question, Kieran, and for the amazing answer, Lillian. So it's been about an hour since we started. Do you have any final remarks before we stop recording?
I feel like I'm surprised by how much we managed to actually cover, because yeah, what really interested me is these are just like fundamental questions that have come up that have actually been informing my PhD. So thank you very much to everyone that asked questions, because it's making me think even more about reflecting on my actual thesis, because I'm writing the introduction like after I've done all my chapters. So it's actually been a really helpful exercise in kind of interrogating, like, what am I actually talking about? So thank you very much. And thanks again, Ashley, once again, for asking me to do this, because I really enjoyed it.
Great, thanks, Lillian. Lillian, because I made you the host, you're going to be the one.
Yeah, I will do that now.
That's great.